Ashley. I'm with the Platypus Affiliated Society. Just thought I would start off by explaining what Platypus Affiliated Society is, since it sounds like a group that's committed to a very strange animal. So the Platypus Affiliated Society was established by a group of students in December 2006 in the city of Chicago. Amidst the apparent politicization of young people by the anti-war movement, these students lacked a space for critical conversations on what it meant to be a leftist in the 21st century. We are kind of grouped around the question, what has the left been, and what can it yet become? Platypus exists because the answer to such a question, even its basic formulation, has long ceased to be self-evident. As a group, we organize reading groups, public fora, research and journalism, focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old, new, and post-political left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. I wanted to thank OPERG for helping with this event, and also to Stephanie Ross for helping. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andoni to explain exactly why we're sitting here today.
Great, thanks a lot, Ashley. My name is Andoni. I'm also with the Platypus Affiliated Society. I'm just going to set up today's event. This is a teach-in in a classic sense, so we had a group of students sort of put together questions around some of the recent work that Sam has written. So probably everybody in this room would agree with the proposition that austerity measures stemming from the global financial crisis threaten to undermine public sector unions and reduce the services they provide. To date, however, the only responses from unions are either defensive, as in the protests over pension reform in France, or disorganized and muted, as in Canada, or notably in the UK, where almost 500,000 jobs are expected to be cut over the next 5 years. Unfortunately, public sector unions seem poised to lose the coming battles, and these are battles that they desperately need to win. Perhaps more disquieting still, even as governments cut jobs, reduce pensions, and eliminate services, no political force appears able to politicize public sector union activity along class lines, and by extension to the left. Rather, as the recent mayoral campaign in Toronto demonstrated, actions by public sector unions are readily mobilized as fodder in the service of an increasingly bellicose anti-labor populism. The inability of the left to unambiguously raise the question of class in the present crisis is not primarily an outcome of the strength of the right, but rather a consequence of the disintegration of the left. Whereas in the 1990s, the austerity measures imposed by the Harris government in Ontario could still be recognized, however faintly, as an attack on the working class, we live now with the consequences of the failure to translate the subsequent anti-Harris mobilization, typified by the Days of Action, into a cohesive left politics. This is in spite of the fact that the Harris period resulted in an influx of new cadres and supporters towards the radical left. But whatever growth that occurred did not breed a movement that could push beyond the McGuinty liberal victory. A renewed attempt to incorporate public sector unionism into a broader left project should thus begin by considering how we've arrived at our present. How might we critique the past, both to avoid the present reproduction of failed strategies on the left, and to generate a new focus for public sector unionism and the left more broadly? Although public sector unionism largely originates in Canada in the 1960s, contemporary public sector work itself develops in the crucible of the 1930s. It is important to recall that this period not only generated a powerful new industrial union strategy in the form of the American CIO, but also a technocratic administrative state dependent on public service workers to function. Given these contradictory origins, it is not surprising that the radicalization in this period coincided with the self-liquidation of a Marxist politics. As old left passed to new left in the 1960s, the nascent public sector unionism was immediately saddled with a legalized and restrictive labor relations framework, and a politics from the left had struggled to find new agencies everywhere but within the working class. In light of this history, how might we understand public services as both an obstacle and as pointing beyond the conditions that gave rise to them? Put another way, how might public service unionism go beyond simply opposing the state as an employer to taking up the task of transforming the state to the end of advancing human freedom to the overcoming of capital? Much of our speaker, Sam Gindin's recent work has addressed the situation of public sector unions. Sam has written and lectured about the ways in which activities might be refocused not only to weather the storm of neoliberal austerity, but also as a potential avenue towards reconfiguring the political left in Canada. Sam has a remarkable career in the Canadian Union movement, first as the research director, then as the assistant to the president of the Canadian Auto Workers, CAW. Since his retirement from the CAW, he's remained really active, and most of you know Sam personally from all the work that he's done. He's, of course, been the visiting Packard Chair in Social Justice at York University, but he also remains very active in the labor movement, both as a member of the Socialist Project, but also in the recently formed Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly. Most recently, he co-authored, along with York faculty Greg Albo and Leo Panich, a fine book titled In and Out of Crisis, The Global Financial Meltdown and Left Alternatives, which I recommend you read. So with that, I would, I'm just going to go over the teach-in. It's going to proceed roughly in the following manner. Sam's going to, he's prepared to speak for about roughly 30 minutes. The remarks are part of these responses that were generated by students within Platypus, and we also had a number of people who are outside of Platypus. And as a plug, when we do these events, these teach-ins, if people want to get involved, it is an excellent way for you to engage with interesting faculty member, read their work carefully, and be able to ask them to collaborate on things that you would like to. But it was also mainly based on a piece that he published with Michael Hurley in May titled Public Sector Searching for Focus, which is available online at socialistproject.com. So without any further delay, I would like you to extend a warm welcome to Sam Gindin.
Thanks. If I look like I'm restless because I'm getting up and sitting down, my back went earlier today, and I'm a little uncomfortable. I think what I've been struggling with is what is it possible to actually do in this context? So it's very much a question of tactics, but trying to put it into some strategic context. And I think Anthony summarized it well. When the public sector was hit with the McGuinty proposal for a wage freeze and the question of austerity, that wasn't a temporary thing. We're living in an age of austerity that isn't going to go away. The question is, how do you deal with that? We're living in a moment where the labor movement, quite generally, has been defeated. This is an old story now. It's been a quarter of a century old story. And the attack on the public sector is so important because the private sector is really on its knees if the public sector is isolated and destroyed over this next process, over the next period. The Canadian labor movement won't look much different than the American labor movement. So the question is, what is there can be done? So I'm approaching this really from trying to figure out some practical response to this. And when I got the questions that Platypus put out, they were really exciting. It was exciting to see these questions. They were really thoughtful. They were challenging. I was trying to think about how to coordinate them into something cohesive, and I don't think I figured out how to do that. So I think what I'll do is talk a little bit just about some of the assumptions that I make, so it makes my own politics a little bit more explicit. Some of that will answer the question, some of it won't. I want to leave time for throwing out an idea in particular, so that people can challenge that idea and see whether it makes sense. And then I probably won't answer all the questions, but there'll be time. I'd certainly like to get to all of them, because I'd like to. Let me first of all say that I think that any of the tactics or strategies that we come up with about what to do are always contradictory. We're coming up with these ideas within capitalism and trying to figure out what to do within capitalism, and they always come up against, if they're successful, the logic of capitalism itself, and then the question is, can you go further or not? And so it raises analytical questions about understanding what we're doing and how it relates to capitalism, but I think one of the points I'm going to make as I go through this is it ultimately raises organizational questions, whether we actually have the capacity as we come up against contradictions, to go further or not. So all our tactics under capitalism, even quite militant ones, are contradictory. And the question always is whether in fighting back all we're doing is actually reproducing the system in some way, or whether in fighting back we're developing some kind of independent capacities, vision, ideology, structure. And I really want to emphasize that doesn't just come out of the nature of the struggle. Some struggles are more prone to raising broader issues than others, but there's nothing automatic about struggles that they actually put these things on the agenda. So I just want to flag that first of all. The second thing I want to say is something about unions that goes beyond public sector unions themselves, something about unions more generally. It's not just that unions aren't revolutionary organizations, that they're not organized to make a revolution, but I think the question can also be asked whether they're class organizations. They come out of the class, but the very nature of unions is sectionalism. They organize workers along in particular sections, not workers in general, to meet certain relatively limited goals. And I think that this becomes a major problem in terms of unions. At particular moments in time, that can be a very successful strategy. In the post-war period, that kind of sectionalism can mean that you make concrete gains, it can mean that you inspire others, it can mean that it begins to add up to something a little bit more, but it's limited. And part of the crisis that the labor movement is in does come out of the limits of the successful unionism that existed before that was so sectionalist. In the moment that we're in right now, this fragmentation of unions is fundamental to the barriers of changing things. Unless there is a new kind of unionism that is actually class-based, and talk a little bit about what that might mean, I don't think unions can even win small battles. I do think there is a need to think in class terms and in larger terms, even to win the small battles. I want to stress in saying this that when I'm being critical of what unions were before, I'm not trying to reduce it to bureaucratization or legalization. I'm trying to get to what the nature of unions are as sectional organizations. So for example, in the debate around the Rand formula in 1945 that gives unions a financial base once they're certified, my position is that the Rand formula it wasn't wrong to accept the Rand formula. But the problem wasn't that unions said, okay, we'll accept this, so we have a financial base. I think those are the kind of compromises you inevitably make within capitalism. If you don't have a solid financial base, you get destroyed when there's a recession or when there's a downturn. For all the upsurge in the 30s in industrial unionism in Canada, by 1938, the union of General Motors basically didn't exist anymore. When the second recession hit, the union almost disappeared. The UAW in Canada was basically hanging on to members by forming rod and gun clubs, hunting clubs, and bowling alleys. And it kind of kept people together as a social organization, but didn't have much of an impact. So the question of having a solid, that wasn't the problem. The question was, if you're going to be getting your dues automatically and don't have to contact every worker individually, what is the other creative ways you're going to find so that you can stay in touch with your members and have a democratic organization? The fishermen, as an example, never got union recognition on the West Coast. And they had to run around collecting dues. So they actually spent a year going to small communities collecting dues, and it was also a barrier to doing other things. It had certain advantages. So I want to stress that this is a major problem with unions, is that sectionalism. The second thing I want to say is there's a sense in which people have thought that, well, maybe the public sector is inherently more political because it directly has to deal with the state. And it emerges at a particular moment in time, at the height of the 60s, at the height of industrial unionism. But the public sector is immediately having to deal with the state. Well, I think it would be a mistake to think that that automatically makes them more political. There's nothing in having to deal with the state as an employer that doesn't open you up to being just as corporatist and just as economistic, and especially just as sectionalist as other unions. Yes, you have to deal with the state. Yes, you have to lobby with the state. But you can do that in a way that says, for example, we think the Liberals will give us a better deal than somebody else, so let's vote for the Liberals. To hell with what this implies for the poor, for the rest of the working class, or anything else. So there's nothing about the public sector itself that determines that. And within the public sector, coming out of the 60s, you found quite different kinds of unionism setting in. Postal workers had a quite different trajectory than QP as an example. The second thing I want to say is that there's a sense in which, well, maybe workers will be politicized in this present period out of necessity. That as collective bargaining is closed down, you don't have any choice but to make more political demands. So hotel workers are concerned with whether the tourism industry is growing, as an example. Bus drivers with what's happening with the transit system. Well, again, I just want to stress that you can have sectionalism in political demands. They can be just as economistic. You can say we want a flourishing hotel business and we want the city rezoned so that hotels can be built everywhere because it's good for our members. Which doesn't really mean that you're thinking about it in class terms. So there's nothing automatic there either. And this question of class pervades everything about unions. It's not just that it's about bargaining. It's about how unions organize. The fall in union membership is related to the fact that unions see organizing in terms of can we get more members for ourselves. Whereas if you were thinking about this in class terms, you'd be thinking about can we build the working class? And maybe at the municipal level, we should all be working together to do it. If you're thinking in sectionalist territorial terms, you don't do that. And I think that's been a major problem. Okay, and let me just raise one other thing too that I guess that keeps coming up. And the question is, well, why, there's all this militancy in Europe. Why don't we find it in Canada? Looking at it in a comparative way. I think we have to be very careful with that. Obviously, there are differences in terms of how people respond based on the particular histories of different countries, whether they've been through a dictatorship recently, whether the left still exists because the left developed a particular base during the war, which was important for the French Communist Party, whether they've just been through apartheid, as has been the case in South Africa. So, of course, history matters, but we shouldn't romanticize what's happening in Europe. A lot of the protests come and go. It's not clear that they can be sustained. It's not clear that they can go further than they've gone. And so far, what we've seen is, in fact, defeats through some resistance. So we shouldn't romanticize that. And the other part of it is we should put our own experience in context. The days of action in Ontario were actually one of the most creative things that happened anywhere. It's not particularly obvious why. Why did that happen in Ontario? Kim Moody in his book, which I don't remember which book it was, he said there were basically 5 places where there were eruptions of remarkable militancy and creativity in the world. South Korea, Brazil, France, South Africa, and Ontario. And the others were a little bit easier to understand in terms of recently coming out of dictatorships or apartheid. The question of why Ontario is really interesting. And the Ontario one was actually, it lasted the longest because it wasn't just a series of large demonstrations that might have lasted for a week or 2 and that were very significant, or a month. It went on for a year and a half. Part of it actually came out of the weakness of the labor movement. It couldn't call a general strike, so it concentrated all its energies into particular communities, and therefore went from community to community on the basis that if you could shut down major manufacturing, which was generally auto in Ontario, which we could do, if you could shut down transit, there was a good base in the transit workers, if you could get the teachers out, which at that point in time we could, and you could shut down the post office, it really looked like a general strike in each community. So in Ontario, you had a situation where it lasted for a year and a half. There were constant discussions for a year and a half, because the media was constantly warning that there was going to be chaos in each city, riots. There was an incredible degree of mobilization. So we should look back at our own experience and try to understand why that happened and what potential it speaks to or doesn't speak to. Okay, I'm going to skip over some of the questions, but I'll come back to them because I want to throw out a particular idea and make a case for why I think it makes sense. When McGinty proposed the wage freeze, the question is how the unions should respond. And Michael Hurley from the Ontario Council of Hospital Unions and I suggested that what was key was understanding that the strategic issue at this moment in time wasn't wages. But it was one thing to defend lowest paid workers and try to bring them up. It was one thing to try to keep your wages up to inflation, but the strategic question wasn't going to be wages. First of all, because we weren't in much of a position to win wage demands. So arguing for wages was often just trade union leaders posturing. You stood up, you said we're going to get 10%, and then when you couldn't, you said, well, I guess the members aren't there, and you got mad at the government, and that was kind of the end of the fight. But the strategic question was going to be services. And the reason that we argued for services was really two things. One is that we saw this as a potential for workers to start actually thinking of themselves not just as wage earners, but as part of a class. That they were producing things and providing things to the rest of the class that was important to themselves, but also to the rest of the class, and that they could actually lead on a social issue. The second thing, which I don't think we spent enough time talking about in that article, but it's kind of emerged in an interesting way since then, is that to talk about services is actually to talk about working conditions. One of the things that's really happened in the public sector is that people feel overwhelmed by their workloads. You see this when you talk to nurses, you see this when you talk to long-term care workers, you see it everywhere. And it's just really driven home to me by how workers were responding to the emphasis on services. Because as soon as you say we're going to make the issue services, not necessarily wages, you're breaking with a particular past that people are used to, and you have to actually go and explain it to workers. So the Ontario Council of Hospital Unions trained their board to go out and to go to each local and start talking to workers about doing this, because you've got to convince workers if you're going to do this. And the interesting reaction of workers was how quickly they picked up on it. They picked up on it very much because of the impact on workload, and because they saw this as a way of actually building a base in the community so that if at other points in time you have other issues, you can actually take them on. So I think that's, so there's that dimension of it. Then the point is, well, how does that get reflected in bargaining? Because if all you're doing is if it's just rhetoric, it's irrelevant. It gives you something to say. It's nice. It gives you something to say to the media, but it isn't going to go anywhere. So to make it real, it has to become part of bargaining. And to make it part of bargaining is a very radical thing, because to put on the bargaining table working conditions and services is putting on the bargaining table employer power and a political demand, which is different than saying, give me a price for my labor and you can do whatever you want with it, and you can do whatever you want with the service. So immediately posed the question of bargaining becoming something quite different. Now again, it means that this changes everything. As soon as you put this at the center of what unions do, bargain, it changes what you spend your research time on, what your research department does. Is it doing comparisons of wages, or is it actually taking a look at what's been happening to services? It changes, the structure of the union. You have to relate to your members differently because you're going to have to really actually mobilize people. And it changes your strategy. I'll give one very good example. The question of striking, let's say in a long-term hospital care situation, is difficult. It's not just difficult because it's illegal. It's actually the least difficult part. It's actually hard. Like, these are the people that you care about and you service, and you don't particularly want to take the services away. So if you're actually thinking about this in terms of services, there's another tactic that you can do, which is to not have a walkout, but to have a walk-in. To actually say, we're going to take workers from second shift or workers who are laid off and bring them into work, not paid. Instead of a strike not being paid, we're going to take people in and not be paid, or maybe they can get strike pay. Now, when you do that, what you're doing is demonstrating what kind of services you can really provide if you're not cutting back on services and squeezing services. You're showing the people in the long-term facility or in the hospital facility or wherever you're doing this that there are certain services that you can provide. And if you do this for a couple of days, as an example, when you leave, it's like a strike. What people notice is that the services are down. And the question is, well, how would the employer respond? Normally, the employer couldn't care less if you brought people in. The demand is wages, and you're not stopping work. What do they care? But if the issue is services, and you're trying to demonstrate that services can actually be improved, then what do? Do they block you from coming in because you're challenging management's right to run these things, and because you're demonstrating that services are valuable, which puts the employer on the spot? They're holding back services. They're refusing to let people come in and actually work for free. What do? Do you block them? And if you let them come in, then you're demonstrating something about the value of services. And it's a strategy that you could do on a rotating basis. You can hit different long-term healthcare facilities at different times and have people come in and can do this. So if you start thinking about this, it's coming out of trying to think in more strategic ways that start bringing class into it, that start actually challenging employer power in terms of the organization of work. It begins to lead somewhere in terms of what you do about education and all your structures and research. It begins to really restart rethinking what unions are. And the other advantage of this is that there's no simple mold for how you would do this. It would depend on the sector. The actual issues you'd mobilize around would depend on the sector, which means that you're saying, here's a model for mobilizing. Let's form committees in each sector that have to cope with this question about what we would do in our sector. Okay, so in the long-term healthcare sector, the idea is we're going to bring people in. In the school sector, it might be different. If the issue is that they're closing schools, the issue would be not just how do you keep schools open. It might actually not be rational to keep certain schools open if the demographics are changing, but how do you keep them open as a social space? But these are incredibly important public spaces. I don't know if the people here are involved in just trying to organize anything. There's user fees for getting into the high schools. You can't get space. You can't actually meet in the communities. But the idea of saying that, well, these should be public spaces and we want them to keep open for all kinds of things. One of the things they did in the early 70s when Livingston became mayor, who left took over, was they kept schools open and they made them into, I don't know what word you use here. You used to use the word shops. I don't know what word you use. In other words, you could come in any time with furniture or anything you wanted to fix or build, and there'd be people around who could help you with it. And there'd be the lumber around, and there'd be equipment around. Obviously, janitors would still be working. And the school would be a public space for that kind of thing. It would be a community space. So the schools would become childcare spaces, public spaces for doing that. There'd be spaces for meetings, so they'd be constantly used. So maybe that's a strategy you come up with if you're in the education sector. The idea would be in every sector, people would have to get together and they'd have to be creative about what they would do. The challenge would be for them to come up with it and for them to figure out, well, how would we organize around it? How are we going to educate our members? What kind of material do we need? How do we build a base in the community? Because that's what we're trying to get to. So you have to think about how to organize in the community. You'd have to have some external support. I mean, there's a role for students to actually do a certain amount of resource work, to work with people and writing pamphlets in terms of being organized. The Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly, which I'm part of, which is built around trying to think about workers as a class and organize the movements and the unions, around the working class. We could imagine, for example, having forums where we get people together from these different sectors to learn what different people did, to be inspired by what different people did, to have skill development classes where people would learn basic organizing skills to do this. So I'm just trying to argue that out of this, you can start beginning to see some kind of reorientation, strategy, which raises larger questions. You just can't help doing that. You can't fight back in the public sector without somebody asking you, how are you going to pay for things? Well, that's good. It's not good to say, don't worry about it. That's a lie. You have to actually take on the question of, yeah, well, where would the money come from? And how would we do that? And that raises other questions. If you say we're going to tax the corporations or we're going to tax the rich, and their response is, yeah, you should try it, and we'll show you what real power is. We'll leave. Well, then you have to ask the question of, why is the financial system not democratic? Is this what capitalism is? A public sector that is demanding different kinds of services is actually beginning to broach the question of transforming the state. Not that unions are going to transform the state in themselves, but they're actually asking what kind of a state we have, what does it do, is it in fact democratic, what would a more democratic state look like? These aren't problems that you can be solved without changing capitalism, but it creates a dynamic, and I think that's a critical part of all these things. And it raises the question of also, what would how would this play out in the private sector? Is this just because then again, you're just kind of dividing the labor movement up in a particular way, and it requires the same kind of creativity. If you're not a worker, the most obvious thing that's happening right now is that there is an enormous amount of excess capacity in the auto industry, and it isn't going to go away. The auto industry is recovering, jobs aren't. And that's been true for 25 years. It's going to continue to happen. So if all you talk about is, we want to stimulate the economy so we have more car sales, first of all, we don't need more cars. And second of all, it's actually not going to give you more jobs. You actually have to think about the productive capacity that exists in the industry. Here we have an industry that can make all kinds of things. It's got skilled workers, it's got all kinds of engineering capacities. What is it that we need? And if people are serious that the environment means that everything about what we produce and how we produce it, including the homes, and including in the factories, including in the infrastructure, is going to be changed over the next century, then it raises the question of some kind of a democratic plan that begins to address that and provides jobs for people. And it's related to bargaining, because it means instead of workers sitting around wondering, what are we going to give up next in bargaining so we can hang on to our jobs, you actually begin to say that's kind of irrelevant. That isn't going to save our jobs anyways. What you're doing is asking, how do we mobilize the community so we actually do something that may seem a little bit impractical right now, but it's probably more practical than just hoping that the corporations are going to keep providing the kind of jobs we've had, which they won't. And one of the things that, again, I think is a message to workers is that as long as, when you raise this with workers, the first response always is, that's a great idea, but it's a little bit academic. I'm worried about tomorrow. And there's one of the problems with the working class movement is that, yeah, if you only worry about tomorrow, you find out you never have any choices. Each day you've got these very narrow range of choices, and nothing ever changes. Unless you're thinking about the longer term, you're not creating new choices. In steel, maybe the issue is infrastructure requires an enormous amount of steel. Maybe that is the kind of thing to focus on. But you can begin to think about in each sector, what might it be, how would we mobilize around it, and also how we coordinate it. How this is all part of thinking about the economy and the state in a different kind of a way. Okay, that's half an hour. So I didn't answer some of the difficult questions, which I really look forward to answering. But I'd also like to I'd also like to get a response to thinking about the trade union movement in a different kind of way and trying to develop a different kind of strategy. Is that just airy-fairy and irrelevant? Or is that something that we can really put on the agenda? And the one thing I really want to stress is I'm skeptical about whether unions in themselves could sustain anything like that. the reason I say that is they might agree that it's a good idea, but part of the defeat is that they would have no confidence in really sustaining it. It can only happen if people are actually organizing as some kind of a left with connections to a larger left that would begin to mobilize around this in their own locals and push their own unions to do this. And that raises, so it keeps coming back to organizational questions. Because without organization, it's very difficult to have hope. You can have very good discussions, and I think that the analytical discussions are absolutely crucial. But it's hard to sustain them. Some people are interested in doing it, and you'll find workers who are actually interested in just having intellectual discussion for the sake of it. But I think that unless there are struggles going on, fights going on, it's difficult to do the intellectual work in isolation. There has to be some wedding of struggles and contradictions and problems and analysis and organization. Okay, I'll stop. I'm tempted to actually ask people to answer these questions. I'd like to hear your own answers. Okay, let me partially answer them, and people can come back a bit. Okay, so Anthony asked the question of where social democracy fits in. Social democracy has normally seen itself as we can offer you a nicer capitalism, particularly through expanding the welfare state. And when you look at the United States, what's actually interesting is that winning a welfare state was blocked very much. And the alternative to it was winning a private welfare state. In other words, unions kind of negotiating their own welfare state. And that's been incredibly damaging in terms of trying to build any kind of a class solidarity. Because what you find out over time is, first of all, if you have a private welfare state, it's going to be undermined by competition. General Motors couldn't sustain it. And second of all, there's going to be no solidarity to defend you, because you're the only one that has it. So, there's something very positive about a welfare state that gives you certain kinds of securities. And this is very important. These were, I think, very important victories that you could win in terms of unemployment insurance or health care or pensions. Not to name them as being revolutionary, but these were important victories that are worth defending. In terms of social democracy today, I guess two things, and you can come back if this doesn't answer your question. One is that what we've learned for a quarter of a century is that capitalism can't actually give you even that kind of a welfare state anymore. And what social democracy has never coped with is that if you even want that kind of a welfare state, you're going to actually have to shift power within the economy. You can't just get that welfare state by getting elected. You have to be prepared to challenge capital in some way. And social democracy has never, social democracy either goes through either missing the actual power of capital, so it comes up with naive things that can't happen, or it actually discovers how powerful capital is and then is awed by it and retreats. And either way, it hasn't played any kind of a role in challenging capital. That's one thing. But the other thing about social democracy has been the nature of the welfare state that it creates. Is one that people do see as being full of bureaucratization, of policing people on welfare, not trying to actually help and support them. Of giving you enough unemployment insurance that you can stay in the labor force so that you're part of the labor market. That gives you enough of a minimum wage, again, to reproduce you, but not to decommodify you so that you can actually feel like you've got some freedom and aren't completely dependent on the market. So unless the question of changing the welfare state is on the agenda, and this isn't just an NDP problem, it's a union problem. Public sector unions are loath to actually debate the limits of the welfare state. They see it as the welfare state is under attack, so we have to defend it. And that tactic is counterproductive. What workers should be saying is, you're absolutely right. shitty in all kinds of ways, and we're fighting to improve it. I mean, that's what we mean when we want to put things on the bargaining table. We want to bargain about the level and the quality of services and how they're run and whether they're democratic or not. And it means taking on some really difficult questions. Like one of the things we did when we were trying to organize the assembly is we brought unionists together with people on welfare to discuss their conflicts. So you have people saying things like, well, the only workers we ever come in touch with are people who are policing us. They're the welfare worker who's trying to cut me off or limit my payment. They're the librarian who's uncomfortable because I'm cold and I'm going into the library and they think that I'm some weirdo that might make their life harder. And those are real questions. I mean, I think those are the kinds of questions that you actually do need to sit down and say, well, how would you deal with that? And it means actually trying to figure out, well, what's the problem? You know, who's the enemy? What's the problem? You know, does this mean that, you know, librarian workers have to say, well, this is an issue. If we're going to provide a service, we want to be trained for it. We want to have more bodies around so we can deal with that. But we have to come up with the creative ideas to do it. Okay. The question of, let me leave the question of apathy for a second. The question of labor aristocracy. The labor aristocracy term has been used in two kinds of ways. One is unionized workers in general, like auto workers as being a labor aristocracy, and then it's used in the sense of the union bureaucracy within the union. Again, the reality about, you know, facing most workers is at certain points in time they were able to make gains that might have been ahead of other workers, but those actually can inspire gains elsewhere. They might have been sectionalists, but they inspire gains elsewhere. When auto workers made gains in the 60s and 70s and in the 80s, or fought concessions in the 60s and 70s and 80s, the message was we actually had enormous support from other workers. The idea was, boy, if they can do it to auto workers, they can do it to anybody. So we had enormous support. And that's no longer true. If auto workers make gains right now, no one else is going to be able to follow. It is completely sectionalist and fragmented. But more important than that, auto workers, you can't talk about them as being privileged in any way. More than half the workforce has now had its wages cut in half. I don't know the number for Canada right now. In the States, 60% of workers are now in a two-tier system, which means that they're making half of what the other rest make, and it means that the rest will be isolated soon. So, you know, they've had massive layoffs. There's more layoffs in the auto industry than anywhere else. So there's nothing privileged about them. They're losing their homes, they're losing their pensions, they're losing their benefits. On the other hand, one of the things that's also happened through the neoliberal period is that a lot of trade union leaders got comfortable with neoliberalism and globalization. You had a ready excuse. Can't do that? Well, it's not my fault. It's globalization and it's neoliberalism. What can I do? And, you know, some of them tried to fight it at first, but I think some of them actually got comfortable with it. It doesn't challenge them to do anything. Because if you're really going to resist, you have to take risks. You have to actually mobilize. You have to create new potential leaders. But I think the main thing I want to say about that is to come back to what I was trying to get at. These are serious problems. Problems of bureaucracy, problems of a lack of democracy, problems of... But I think the main problem is not thinking in class terms. I think this is the main issue, that you have to understand, you know, that either you're trying to build the working class because it is in your interest and a universal interest, or if you're sectionalist, it doesn't matter if you have better leaders. You know, democracy can sometimes be very sectionalist. You can elect a lot of, you know, you can have a rebellion in your union because some rank and file members think that you haven't been militant enough in terms of winning things for them. You can have assembly line workers who think that, you know, we want a higher wage, and if that means that the parts industry workers get screwed, well, that's unfortunate. So democracy itself, without some vision and some class orientation, is a problem. So I really want to stress that we think about this in terms of class and ask questions about, if it was driven by class interests, what would that mean? Okay. That gets to the question that was raised about, well, what are unions? And I want to be careful about this. I think that there are limits to what unions can be. I mean, unions, get, you know, it isn't as if people are in GM. It's not like, all the socialists at General Motors got together and said, let's form a union. You're representing whoever happens to be in Oshawa working at the time. Some of them are conservative. Some of them don't particularly like unions, but they like their own union because it does something for them. So there's nothing particularly political about the organization. And trying to make it into a better organization is positive, but it has its limits. I don't think it can ever be a revolutionary organization. It's got a mandate to try to defend you in the workplace. Most unionization today is about dignity. So you want some dignity in the workplace. You probably want your corporations to do well, because if it isn't doing well, there's not going to be much for me to get. And if it's not doing well, there's going to be layoffs, and I'm going to have to squeeze it some more. So there's nothing inherent. I think there's something inherent about the work relationship that nurtures some kind of resistance. I want to be treated better. I think I'm getting screwed over. I think there's something here to get. But that's different than some kind of spontaneous move towards revolutionary sentiments. I think the key is to try to move unions so that they're not as sectionalist and fragmented, that have some sense of solidarity and class and internationalism. Maybe I'll come back to internationalism later. But also create a space where you can do that kind of education. So you are building socialists, anti-capitalists within the organization. And you can't do that unless there's an outside left. 5 people getting together in a workplace, just think of themselves as 5 people getting together in a workplace. They have no connection to anybody else. Their leader has way more authority. They travel around the world, they travel around the country, they meet governments, so they know what's going on, in quotation marks. And when they tell you that this is what our research department is telling us the limits of what you can do are, it's pretty hard for 5 people in a workplace in St. Catharines to say, you're full of shit. So you have to be part of something larger. So ideally, a union is a place where you're recruiting, you're developing some people, but you've got an organization that has its feet inside unions and outside. Partly because they should be across unions, partly because they should be in the community. But I think that's the only space in which you can actually have the more radical ideas. The question of apathy. I don't know. I'd really like to hear from people about that. People are. I don't know that people are apathetic. You could actually argue that what people showed in the Rock Ford vote was that they could be mobilized. They're actually angry, and they're ready to do something. I think we have to kind of stop looking at complaining about others and think about what we actually have to offer. What is it we actually have to offer? Sometimes, for example, a friend used the term psychological adventurism. We were doing an educational, and we were saying all kinds of radical things. And she said, that's just psychological adventurism. And what she meant was, people love it. You're giving them the stuff, and they love it. And when they go home, they have nothing to do with it. There's nothing to plug into. So all they do is they're kind of lost. They've got these great ideas that they like to do things, but there's no way of expressing it. There's no way of doing something about it, so you retreat. And it's actually hard to cope with if you've got big ideas and you've got higher expectations and you can't do. Sometimes it's actually easier to say, I don't want to think about it. If I can't do anything. And my experience in the union was that if I wrote things that I thought were great and nothing was going on, they were usually ignored. And when there were struggles going on, people demanded information. So I think it's part of actually trying to structure some struggles that are meaningful and can go someplace. And I think that in that context, I think that people can be moved. I just don't know what else there is to do. I don't think that we can move people very much in the abstract. I think there have to be struggles that are more creative and open and speak to what they're talking about. And people are obviously upset. People do not think that life is wonderful. I have trouble finding any worker that you couldn't say to them, capitalism sucks, and they wouldn't say, right on. Everybody knows that. It's just that, but there's nothing you can do about it, so it doesn't really matter. And if you can't do anything about it, you just kind of cope with what is. So I find, I find people have more of an education than they've ever had, certainly than they had in the 30s. In the Depression, people are more educated, they read, they're in touch, but they don't think that things are possible. I think that gets to your point. I think what's really out there is fatalism. I think that's the big challenge, that people don't think things are possible. We don't have a model to look to. There's nothing to point to somebody to prove it. So, I think it's a unique generation. That social democracy may have been alive, but nobody believes in it. Communism has died. Unionism is a vehicle for really changing things. Unions are in crisis. So there's a generation that has to live with the reality that they don't have anything to look to. And they kind of got to look to themselves and say, I'm ready to kind of believe in something else and do it. And I don't want to be alone doing it. So I think fatalism is the main thing. And again, I don't think that fatalism can be overcome except through organization. Talking might help, but I think it's going to require some kind of sense of organization, and we're not alone and things are possible. And your question about I think you're getting at, does having some kind of political consciousness, and class consciousness and political consciousness, materially affect what people do and how they function in their unions? I'd say, yeah, I mean, absolutely. In the sense that it grounds you. It gives you some orientation to what you're doing. It makes sense of the world. If things are difficult, it kind of makes sense of what the barriers are without illusions. And I think it's absolutely crucial to be sober and, in terms of what's going on. I guess what I presented here as a proposal comes out of not just kind of random discussions. It comes out of trying to think about the nature of the impasse. Where's capitalism at? Some understanding of capitalism. What is the state doing? How is the state going to resolve this crisis? What is it that unions can do in terms of moving towards some better class understanding, and how does that impact? Confidence in the working class as an agency. This is something that requires a certain amount of creativity and organizing. So I think it's absolutely fundamental, and I'm saying it in a way that doesn't kind of draw lines. Like if you have a Marxist analysis, you'll immediately know what to do in this situation. But I think, just at a personal level, I think it kind of kept me going. I think that it's sometimes kind of hard to keep going, watching the world unravel and feeling like you're in a treadmill. So I think having that kind, having an understanding of capitalism and the potentials for change, the potentials of the working class within it, is really fundamental. I should say one thing about, maybe just a little bit to what Jeremy was saying. I found that even the best trade unionists who weren't Marxists, talking to them about the potential of the working class, what they were getting when I was saying it was the shop stewards. In other words, the union kind of was the union activists. Their confidence in the working class as possibly changing things. I once wrote something on socialism with sober senses, which I saw as a really optimistic call about the potentials of the working class. I remember giving it to my boss, the head of the union, and he saw it as proving that socialism was impossible, because it was difficult. And I think that most trade union leaders see workers as they're great if they have enough sense to follow us, that the union is actually the core of activists. And I don't think they think of the union culture as much beyond that. Let me go back to Jeremy's question. I mean, we shouldn't be surprised that, unions will have certain kinds of problems in terms of democracy and power structures, both because there's a tendency in all institutions to have problems, including on the left, and because they're interacting with capitalism that affects them in a particular way. I mean, ranging from they're really centralized, so we have to be centralized to be effective. There's a certain Stalinism that emerges in unions at points, to just leaders, the temptation to make deals with the company for their own interest. And sometimes they make those deals because they actually think they're the best and only thing that's possible. It isn't even like a personal thing. So the conclusion from it is just, we think it's hard to change capitalism, but part of changing capitalism is changing our own organization. And if we can't change our own organizations, I don't see any optimism about changing something much more complicated. So it does come back to organizing. And I think the main thing I just would emphasize is I don't think you can successfully organize if your world is only organizing in your union. They just have overwhelming power in terms of resources. So you have to be connected to other things, other workers, other organizations. Concrete struggles. I really want to stress that I said that struggles are a necessary condition, but there's nothing sufficient about them to improve consciousness at all. I mean, you can spend an awful lot of time, and I know a lot of activists who do this, going from picket line to picket line. And it's not clear, that might be useful, it might be morally really admirable. It's not clear what gets built from it, unless you're actually sitting down and strategizing and saying something like, well, which of these struggles could actually go someplace different? Which of these could you actually do something that, might signal some turn in what's happening? When there was the Cadillac Fairview strike, which went on for about 9 months, and what they were basically taking was a unionized workforce and saying, we don't care what the labor board says, we don't care what the collective agreement says, we're going to do whatever we want. And the labor movement was doing nothing about it. And so we actually got some people together and we said, well, this is a horrific message. Don't do anything about this. It's just going to escalate. Everyone's going to be fair game. And we decided to take over the teachers' pension fund, to go into the building and take over the teachers' pension fund, which was, the main asset holder. It turned out the same week that we planned to do that, there actually was a labor board decision in the workers' favor. But it was just the beginning of saying, okay, let's sit down and strategize. What could we do? How would we do it? What is the range of tactics? So I'd really emphasize that, struggles are necessary. Without struggles, nothing happens. Resistance is necessary, but we do have to think about, what makes certain struggles strategic or not. And then even then, what about the particular way we fight back makes them strategic? You just fight in a normal way. Class. I'd like you to come back on it after I answer, because I may be taking this in exactly the opposite direction that you wanted to. So I'll talk about class and the assembly, what we were dealing with in the assembly. In the assembly, we were very much trying to get movements together and unionists together. And both of them weren't very open to speaking in class terms. Movements because they saw using class as an excuse not to talk about gender and race. And unions because it's kind of old language. What's this class stuff? Class war, that's kind of old stuff. And we were determined that that had to be a basis for actual unity, and that there were two things we were trying to do with class. One was to say that class wasn't just in the workplace, that class was expressed in the city throughout your whole life. So, that kind of linked up with organizing in a physical, geographic community space. It also came out of the limits of just organizing in the workplace, where unions have a certain amount of control, and there were some opportunities for actually reaching people through other issues, like free transit. So it was to speak about class as something that went beyond just the workplace on the one hand, that it was expressed in all kinds of ways. And then to define class in terms of a relationship to capital Somebody doesn't like it. But, but also to speak to it in a particular relationship to capital. So, for example, one woman said to me, I'm a disabled, lesbian, woman in poverty. What's class got to do with me? And my response wasn't that class would answer every problem, but it was a couple of things. One was that you have a disability, but you're perfectly capable of being a productive member of society. You're perfectly capable of working and getting a decent income from it. You're denied a chance to work because you're not considered profitable to companies. So that your relationship to work, you don't have capital, you can't live off of somebody else's labor. You're a worker, which she accepted, and that the working class itself is completely, there's no such thing as the working class in the abstract. As soon as you talk about the working class concretely, it's people who are, young and old, and black and white, and tall and short, whatever. There's all kinds of differences, some more significant than others. But the point was that how do you actually build something united around all those differences without ignoring them? And how do you respect each other as part of a class in a way that really is democratic? So, that's kind of how we try to deal with it, to think about class as being in all dimensions of our lives, and class is a broad enough category that if you're defining it in terms of not living off your capital or the labor powers of others, we're including precarious workers, unemployed workers, people struggling around. We don't decentralize gendered issues. We're not interested in organizing the Maggie Thatchers, but we are interested in domestic black workers who have the same problems as the rest of the working class in the way. What did I leave out? I think I left out your question, which was what?
The issue of politics.
Oh yeah, issue of politics. Again, you might want to pursue it, so I'm getting it right. Some of the demands that we might call bourgeois, like fewer hours, can also be radical demands. I mean, what's a radical demand and what isn't a radical demand depends on what's achievable. So, for example, if capital is completely determined that you're not going to get a wage increase, and there's going to be a wage freeze, and you ask for a wage demand, it might actually be a very radical demand. And the same demand at a moment in time when capital is doing very well may just be the best way of co-opting you and integrating you. So the demand itself depends on the times, and a demand like fewer hours can be very radical in the sense that I don't think we can actually build a movement given how many hours people work. And so unless people take some of their time back, not just to share work in the sense that that'll create more jobs, because I actually want time to read. And that was fundamental to the development of the trade union movement in Canada, coming out of the trades in 130 years ago or so. The demands were about time. And a lot of them actually articulated in terms of time and reading, and seeing themselves as actually intellectuals. Again, small businessmen can be considered to be very small. So things like hours can also be quite a radical demand. But I think your main point is right. I mean, you make demands and they come up against limits. And then the question, that's when the real question is. And that's why, when the left has a role to play. So you make a demand. What's the most important demand for a worker? They want to keep their job. What can unions generally do the least about? Giving you jobs. Well, unions don't hand out jobs. Around work time they might be able to share some of the existing money. So a critical question ends up to be, well, what are you going to do about jobs? And if you're actually going to say something about it, you can say the usual stuff. We're going to ask the government to lower taxes or stimulate the economy. Or you can actually say, well, capitalism is telling us they can't provide decent jobs. We want to talk about that. Capitalism is saying that there aren't things we need or can afford. In other words, you can start having a discussion about why can't society be organized more rationally? So, the most ludicrous thing you can imagine is that people who actually want to contribute something are denied that opportunity. That it just doesn't make sense. So I think that is, a critical political question, that when you come up against that limit, people don't, based on their own experience, say, well, I guess that's the limit. Who's going to be out there saying, you got to cross those limits? Let me just give a very quick example from the very first conference I went to, meeting I went to in the auto workers when I got the job. It was around the time of the energy crisis in '73. And this is my big moment. I get to write documents for a union. I wrote a document that started off with a crisis in capitalism. Nobody used that word before. But people were kind of a little bit open to it. They kind of let me keep it. And a communist stood up on the floor of the meeting and said, this is really exciting. After 150 years, the unions recognized that there's a thing called capitalism that exists. And he said that, there wasn't always capitalism. It didn't just come from nowhere. There used to be a thing called feudalism. And in 1 minute, he described feudalism, and he says, and that changed. And he says, and capitalism's probably going to change too, if we make it happen. I want you all to write down that on this and this day, I told you this. And I'll probably be dead, but you can pull it out of your wallet when it begins to happen, you'll remember it. And the point is, he was able to, in the space of 3 minutes, take something that the leadership kind of saw as, well, settle down, people who are asking for something more radical. Instead of just kind of writing it off, expose that minute to begin raising some questions. To get people to say, hey, there is a thing called capitalism. Let's think about it. What does it mean? Is it forever? Was it always there? So those kinds of interventions are important. And they come out of having some analysis.
I'm also conscious of the fact that you're probably, Sam has been very generous to us. He's a little bit under the weather. So I think what we'll do is take one last round of 3 questions. If anybody has some questions, and then we'll wrap up this teach-in.
During the free trade fight around NAFTA, it was around the Canada-US free trade agreement, business put out ads, full-page ads, praising the welfare state, because they saw themselves as being vulnerable to the charge that free trade would undermine it. And it was exactly in that nationalist, patriotic language. This is our welfare state, so don't worry about it. And it was kind of contradictory. It did a certain amount of co-optation. On the other hand, it raised expectations that could be used against business as soon as they started attacking it later. But yeah, I think it does obscure what the nature of the welfare state is, the limits of it. Again, not just romanticizing it, but expressing it in class terms. I might say something just about internationalism, just before I'll come back to that. The point that you raised about geography, and I think is very important. What I was laying out before, in terms of organizing by sector, or subsector, whatever, when we started discussing this, one of the first things that came up was geography. So it really is organizing by sector and geography. Even if you're organizing long-term healthcare workers, they live in different places. They're all over the province. So you have to think about that. And organizing takes place in a place, space, in a place. So geography is absolutely critical to thinking this through, and then thinking about, well, how do you actually unite people if they're fragmented geographically, which I think is important. And then it raises the question, which I think was one of the questions, maybe it was yours in this set of questions. A lot of the left is the urban left. It's a Toronto left. And a lot of the people that they're talking about is suburban, working class. And they haven't really bridged this. We've just kind of been talking about this in the assembly. There's a question of starting to have forums on free transit out in the suburbs. But it's a really important question. I think it gets also the question of rhetoric and language and vision. On the one hand, we have to respect, this defeat that we talk about wasn't just the defeat of the working class and unions, it was the defeat of the left. The left has lost an enormous amount of capacities which weren't reproduced. There are things that it used to do better, and it wasn't that great even when it was doing things better. that, you know, it has to relearn and rediscover. You know, when you look at, you know, just this question of relearning, as an example, when you look at an auto plant over the last 25 years, what you'll find out is that workers who knew how to take on working conditions and workplace issues learned it when they came in from the people who built the union. It's just passed on. The people who came in after the early 80s didn't learn anything because there was no struggles going on. So for 20 or 30 years, people haven't learned how do you fight without getting your head chopped off. On the other hand, the companies for 20 or 30 years have spent 20 or 30 years getting more and more sophisticated. You know, I mean, they stopped hiring foremen as people came out of the working class and began to hire them straight out of university. It was an advantage that they knew nothing about the auto industry because that's not what their job was. Their job was making people, not making cars, somebody said. You know, they set up their own universities. GM has universities, like literally, for doing this stuff. So it's not surprise that it is so difficult to figure out how to do that again. It's not just that the climate is so difficult. It's that we've not learned. So this question of relearning all this stuff is critical. I think there's an advantage to the right, not just because they control the media and everything else. You know, it is a simple story. When you're trying to reinforce the status quo, you can tell simple stories. When you're trying to change the world, simple stories can get in the way. On the other hand, I think there's a real, maybe this is bad politics, but I think there's a real opportunity for a lot more populism. Less populism. Just express some anger. You know, and just use some anger and some, you know, just, you know, like with the banks or whatever. I mean, I think there's a lack of that. On the other hand, you do need the analysis, and I'll just give one very quick example. I just want to say something about internationalism. When the crisis hit, the financial crisis hit, Michael Moore told everybody to get out on the streets and refuse to give banks any kind of a bailout. And I wrote something critical. People thought, why did you do that? And my argument was that you just can't sustain it. After 3 days, people are going to say, yeah, but I can't cash my check, and I've got a pension. And so just saying, screw the banks, wasn't actually a strategy. You know, if you're a serious left person, you'd have to be honest about the fact that, yeah, populism is good. Michael Moore does a lot of terrific stuff, but you had to have more than that. You know, like if you weren't going to say, let's actually start having a discussion on how to take over the banks, make them into a democratic public utility, use that as a lever for actually transforming the economy. I mean, something. But just saying, screw the banks, was actually going to backfire. And that's what actually happened. Within 3 days, I know that the calls were something like 10 to 1 in favor of not giving the banks anything the first day. 3 days later, people were calling their, you know, their representatives saying, you better bail them out, because otherwise my factory's going to close or my job. I just want to say something about internationalism because we didn't talk about it. It came up in the questions in terms of, well, what can public sector workers, or you know, what I was proposing, have to do with globalization. Globalization is such a is the big thing. I think the struggles really begin at home, and I think that the struggles in the public sector are to start raising consciousness about transforming the state, to stop having illusions about the state, and to actually play some leading role in transforming the state. That if we actually want to change the world internationally, it isn't about having international unions that are international business unions, which is what international unionism is often meant. It means that, you know, what you can actually get from international stuff is, in a sense, kind of modest. You know, you can be inspired by other struggles. You can learn from other struggles. We're not critical enough in terms of taking a look at what's happening in other places, so we can learn from what they're doing. You can support people when there's a very specific thing going on. People, you know, there's a major strike someplace. Of course, you can support them, but we can't do much for them until we're organized. I mean, auto workers and steel workers don't talk to each other. It doesn't make a lot of sense to think that they're going to do something for steel workers in India. So the biggest task is actually to organize here, you know, with some consciousness of, if we're going to take on capital and restructure capital, it's going to be taking on globalization, it's going to be taking on the state. And above all, it means that we're going to do things here on the assumption that we're not the only ones in the world doing things. If we were, we're not going to win. Canada is not going to make the revolution itself. the American working class would be a big help. But the assumption is that you can do things, and you can affect other people, and you can inspire them, and you create spaces. When you're fighting in one place, it makes it easier for people to fight someplace else.